Stop. The Arcturian Sentinels have already deployed. This is not a message that arrived early. The grid is active around your frequency signature right now, and what you do in the next several minutes matters more than you may realize. This transmission comes directly from the Arcturian field observers. They have been tracking your signature. They authorized this deployment tonight because your frequency reached a magnitude that does not go unnoticed. And what is drawn to a field at that magnitude is not always benign. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what warning signs were already present before this grid was deployed, what the perimeter is actively blocking around your field right now, and what held stillness posture is required during the anchoring window so the grid sets at full integrity without internal distortion. But here is the first revelation. The pressure, the leaking energy, the strange interference, the sense that something keeps pressing against you from outside your awareness, that was not confusion. That was not a bad week. That was your signature broadcasting at a level that attracted hostile attention, and the Arcturian Sentinels already recognized the pattern before you named it. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. What brought you here is the same field pressure that triggered the deployment. The timing is not coincidence. It is confirmation that the grid anchoring window is already open, and you are standing inside it right now. You were guided here because the warning is already active. What you felt before this transmission found you was not nothing. It was already something, a pressure with weight, with direction, with a frequency signature that the Arcturian field analysis had already begun tracking before you had language for what you were experiencing. The pressure you have been carrying, the kind that does not attach cleanly to any single event, any single relationship, any single decision, that pressure is not a symptom of your weakness. It is evidence of your magnitude. A dim signal does not attract what a strong one does. A field broadcasting at low output moves through the larger field without drawing attention. But a field broadcasting at the level yours has been reaching, that field illuminates itself against the surrounding frequency environment the way a lit window illuminates against a dark street. Everything in range can see it. Not everything in range is safe. That is what the Arcturian Sentinels recognized. That is what triggered the deployment. Not your fear, not your confusion, not the visible symptoms of your difficulty. Your signal itself, the raw output of a field operating at genuine magnitude, was what crossed the threshold that authorized a perimeter response. The Sentinels do not come for the frightened. They come for the powerful who are not yet fully protected. And their arrival is the first confirmation that what you have been feeling was never as small as the explanations you are offering it. But here is what most people in your position do not understand in time. The warning phase does not begin the moment something breaks. It begins long before that. It begins in the quiet, in the margins, in the spaces between events, where the mind is not paying careful attention. It begins with small disturbances that the rational mind is extraordinarily good at explaining away. Because the rational mind was built to preserve coherence. And coherence requires a story that holds together. And the easiest story is always the most ordinary one. It begins with the kind of friction that accumulates in clusters. Not one strange event, but several, arriving too close together to feel truly separate and yet far apart enough that the mind keeps refusing to connect them. a decision that felt clean, and then developed an edge. A conversation that ended wrong and left something behind it you kept meaning to examine. An environment that shifted its quality so subtly, you only noticed weeks later that you had stopped feeling replenished by it. It begins with the feeling that something is pressing against the field from the outside before any outer event has fully formed. A sourceless resistance, a subtle thickening of the air around your choices, a sense that what should be straightforward keeps requiring more force than it should. That pressure, that strange, distributed weight, is not stress in the ordinary sense. It is the first readable surface of a warning already in motion beneath the level most people know how to interpret. The Arcturian Sentinels do not deploy for ordinary turbulence. They do not authorize a field grid around a signature that is simply going through difficulty. Difficulty is common. Interference is specific. What the Sentinels respond to is a precise convergence of conditions, a field operating at high output, drawing attention from the larger frequency environment that it cannot yet fully identify, showing early measurable signs of frequency compromise at the boundary layer, and moving along a trajectory toward a threshold where misreading the signals transitions from costly to genuinely dangerous. That is the pattern that was recognized in your field. Not a guess, not a general concern. A specific, mapped pattern that the Arcturian Field Observation System has identified across many signatures, many timelines, many phases of pressure, and that it has learned to intercept before the outer rupture makes recognition unavoidable. That is why the grid is active around you right now. And that is why this transmission reached you at this moment rather than any other. What you need to understand about the warning phase is how deliberately quiet it begins. The first disturbances are small enough to rationalize. A conversation that ends strangely and leaves a residue you cannot name. Something spoken that released a charge into the space between you and another person. And neither of you addressed it, and it settled into the relational field like sediment. A decision that felt right, and then, days later, begins to feel subtly wrong in a way you struggle to articulate. Not wrong because circumstances changed, but wrong in some interior register that your language keeps falling short of. A relationship that has not visibly changed but now carries a different energetic texture, heavier, more effortful, as though what once moved easily between you now requires a navigational effort that wasn't there before, an unexpected obstacle appearing right before a moment of movement, as though something in the field read your readiness and arrived precisely at the threshold to test whether you would still advance. None of these, taken alone, triggers alarm. The mind processes each one individually and finds a local explanation for each one, and the local explanations are always available, always plausible, always just sufficient enough to close the interpretive question before it deepens. Together, without the individual closure the mind keeps applying, they form a pattern the Arcturians call pre-pressure accumulation, the quiet, systematic stacking of field disturbance before the outer system begins to visibly destabilize. Like hairline fractures appearing in a structure long before anyone can see that the wall is about to give. Most people reach the visible rupture without ever having recognized the accumulation phase. That is not failure. That is what happens when a field is under interference, and the interference is actively disguising itself as ordinary life. Interference does not arrive in a form you can immediately identify as foreign. It does not present itself as invasion. It uses the language of coincidence, bad timing, normal friction, personal stress, seasonal difficulty, ordinary relational wear. It borrows the entire vocabulary of your lived experience so that you keep applying ordinary explanations to something that is not ordinary at all. And every ordinary explanation you accept is another interval in which the accumulation continues without resistance. This is why the Arcturian warning system does not ask you to feel certain before you respond. It does not require proof in the ordinary evidentiary sense. It asks you to stop dismissing what keeps repeating without resolution. That distinction is critical. Certainty comes after the break. Recognition is what happens before it. And recognition, by its nature, operates on pattern rather than proof. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission put language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference log, 7 signs your frequency is compromised, was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. The first pattern that marks a field under genuine pressure is the arrival of what the Arcturians identify as threshold clustering. This is when disruptions begin appearing, specifically around moments of movement, decision, or activation, not scattered randomly across the calendar of your life, but concentrated with notable precision around the exact moments when something important is about to shift. You move toward a decision, and clarity fractures right at the point of commitment. You prepare to step into a new phase, and your footing destabilizes at the exact edge of movement. You feel the readiness building, the conditions aligning, and then the energy around you thickens. The signals become contradictory. The people you were counting on become strangely unavailable. A new problem surfaces that demands attention and pulls your focus away from the threshold you were approaching. The clustering is not even across time. It is located. It appears where momentum would carry you forward, and it applies pressure precisely where forward movement would increase your frequency most significantly. Threshold clustering is not coincidence piling up at inconvenient moments. It is interference reading your field with enough precision to identify where pressure will be most effective and applying it there consistently, repeatedly, at every threshold that matters. Recognizing this pattern does not require certainty that interference is the cause. It requires only the honest observation that the friction is not random. It has a location, and that location keeps being the threshold. The second pattern is what the Arcturians call energetic drainage without visible cause. This is the experience of waking with less than you had when you slept. Not the ordinary morning heaviness of insufficient rest, but a deficit that sleep does not replenish, that rest does not restore, that improvement in outer circumstances does not resolve. It is the experience of completing tasks that should be within your ordinary capacity, and finding yourself disproportionately depleted afterward. as though the effort required was drawing from a deeper reserve than the task itself should have touched. It is the experience of spending time in certain environments or around certain individuals and emerging from that contact measurably diminished, not from any identifiable conflict or exertion, but from something that operated below the visible surface of the interaction. This is not tiredness as the ordinary system understands it. Tiredness has an accountable source: exertion, inadequate sleep, sustained emotional difficulty, physical demand. What the Arcturians are identifying in this pattern is a qualitatively different depletion. One that does not behave the way tiredness behaves, that does not resolve the way tiredness resolves, that returns even after the conditions that would produce ordinary depletion have been addressed. When your frequency is being drawn from at the field level, the internal system does not always register it immediately as crisis. It registers it first as a persistent, low-grade, sourceless drain, the kind that sits below the threshold of alarm but accumulates over time into a significant reduction in field capacity. If this quality of depletion is familiar, if you have been resting adequately and still waking depleted, improving your outer circumstances and still feeling diminished, that pattern is not a sign of fragility or burnout in the clinical sense. It is a sign that something in your field environment has been extracting from your output without your awareness or authorization. The third pattern is false calm insertion. This is one of the most strategically dangerous phases in the interference sequence because it is specifically designed to be misread as resolution. False calm arrives after a period of identifiable pressure. It feels like relief, genuine, earned, credible relief. The weight that was present lifts. The friction that was constant eases. The sense of something pressing from outside the field retreats. And in its absence, the mind does what minds do after sustained tension. It relaxes its interpretive alertness, accepts the ease as evidence that the difficult phase has passed, and begins to reduce the level of field awareness it was maintaining during the pressure period. That reduction is precisely what the false calm was designed to produce. Because what the Arcturian field analysis identifies in this sequence is that the retreat is not resolution. It is the pressure system pulling back to allow the field to lower its guard, so that the next escalation can arrive into a less defended state and register at higher impact than it would have if the field had remained alert. False calm is the held breath between waves. It is the interval that feels like the end of the storm because the immediate intensity has passed, but that is actually the eye, the deceptive stillness at the center of a system that has not finished. If you have experienced a period of pressure, followed by a sudden and somewhat inexplicable sense of ease, followed by a return of disruption that arrived harder and faster than what came before it, you have already moved through a false calm insertion cycle. You lived it. The pattern was structured. And the fact that you are here, receiving this transmission, suggests the field already knew, at some level, that the ease was not as conclusive as it appeared. The fourth pattern is signal contamination, the phase at which interference moves from the outer layer of your experience into the internal interpretive system itself. This is a critical escalation in the warning sequence, because the interpretive system is the instrument you use to assess everything else. When a field is under sustained pressure, the internal guidance mechanism begins producing readings that are subtly distorted, not dramatically wrong, not obviously inverted, but slightly off in ways that are difficult to detect because the instrument producing the distorted reading is also the instrument you would normally use to check for distortion. Intuitions that feel clear but lead you into confusion. Decisions that feel aligned in the moment but produce friction immediately upon execution, as though what felt like the right door opened into the wrong room. The sense that you know what is true about your situation, what is right for your next movement. And yet the outcomes keep contradicting the knowing. Not once, not twice, but in a pattern that accumulates until the confidence in your own internal guidance begins to erode. This erosion is itself part of the interference strategy, because a field that no longer trusts its own signal is a field that has lost its most reliable navigational instrument. When signal contamination is active, ordinary discernment becomes unreliable in precisely the areas where clarity matters most. And the field becomes progressively more vulnerable to misreading its own escalating warning signals as ordinary stress, as personal limitation, as the ordinary noise of a life under pressure, rather than the structured escalation of an interference pattern that has now reached the interpretive core. The fifth pattern is escalation before the visible break. This is the phase that arrives when the earlier warning patterns have moved through the field without full recognition and response. When the pre-pressure accumulation was rationalized away, when the threshold clustering was attributed to bad timing, when the drainage was explained as burnout, when the false calm was accepted as genuine resolution, when the signal contamination quietly degraded the guidance system without being named. At this stage, the pressure that was previously distributed across multiple subtle signals reorganizes into simultaneous, visible intensification across multiple areas of life. Relationships that were strained begin to fracture under weight they can no longer hold. Situations that were unstable tip into active destabilization. Decisions that were deferred by the false calm now demand resolution from a field that is operating at reduced capacity. The outer world presents what looks like genuine crisis arriving from multiple directions at once, and the internal state, compromised by the earlier phases, is no longer clear enough to distinguish between what is natural transition, what is interference in its final escalation stage, and what is the consequence of the earlier threshold crossings the field did not fully recognize. This is the phase the Arcturian warning system is specifically structured to prevent. Not because a field cannot survive it, but because navigating it requires an enormous expenditure of field resource that becomes unavailable for the work the signature was built to do. Every unit of capacity consumed in surviving a visible break is a unit that was not available for forward movement. The Sentinels deploy to make the crossing visible before it happens. That is the only window in which the cost of recognition is still significantly lower than the cost of the rupture. The sixth pattern is what the Arcturians identify as isolation from aligned support. When a field is under sustained interference, one of the most consistent secondary effects is a gradual, systematic erosion of the connections and environments that would naturally support frequency, stability. This erosion rarely announces itself as loss in any dramatic or immediately legible form. It arrives instead as a progressive distancing. A mentor who becomes harder to reach without any specific rupture occurring. A trusted connection that begins to feel slightly misaligned in a way neither party can clearly name. a community or practice that once carried genuine replenishing energy and now feels flat, performative, hollow, a sense of increasing solitude, not in the general relational sense, but specifically in the areas where your frequency most needs resonance, where the input from an aligned source would most directly support the field's capacity to resist the pressure already active around it. The Arcturians are precise about what this represents. Isolation from aligned support, when it occurs within the context of other interference patterns already active in the field, is not ordinary relational drift or the natural evolution of connections over time. It functions as a containment mechanism, systematically reducing the frequency inputs that would otherwise sustain the field's resistance, leaving the signature increasingly dependent on its own resources during exactly the period when those resources are being drawn from by the drainage pattern already in operation. If you have been noticing that the relationships, communities, and practices that once felt most aligned have become strangely inaccessible, energetically diminished, or difficult to sustain without disproportionate effort, that pattern is not personal failure, and it is not coincidence. It is the interference sequence targeting your field's natural support architecture with deliberate precision. The seventh pattern is the return of the unresolved signal. This is the pattern the Arcturians regard as one of the clearest indicators that a warning has moved past the point of ordinary notice and into the phase of active escalation. The unresolved signal is a disturbance, a premonition, an intuition, a recurring image or sensation or situational quality that first appeared at an earlier point in the warning sequence. Often near the beginning, often during the pre-pressure accumulation phase, and was not given the depth of attention it carried. It was noted, perhaps. It was felt, but the explanation offered for it was insufficient, and the attention it received was not proportional to the magnitude of what it was signaling. So it returns, not in the identical form. Interference is not mechanical, and the field in which the signal is received has changed between the first appearance and the return. It arrives transformed, wearing a different outer context, embedded in a different circumstance, presenting through a different relationship or decision or moment of tension. The surface is new, but the frequency signature beneath the surface is identical to what the signal carried the first time it came. The Arcturian field analysis identifies the return not by its form, but by that frequency marker, the specific energetic quality that makes it the same warning regardless of what container it arrives in. When the same warning returns in a new disguise, it is not repeating out of cosmic indifference to whether you noticed it before. It is escalating, arriving with increased amplitude, decreased interval, and a closing window, because the threshold for easier correction is narrowing, and the field's intelligence will not allow a warning of this magnitude to pass into invisibility without one more, louder, more insistent attempt to be recognized. What you are being shown in this transmission is not a worst-case scenario assembled to produce alarm. It is a diagnostic map of what is already present and already active in your field, named with enough precision that you can stop offering the wrong explanations to the right signals. Each pattern described here has a corresponding experience in your life that you have already had. The names were what you were missing, not the events. The events were already there, already accumulating, already forming the recognizable shape of a warning phase in motion. The Arcturian Sentinels did not arrive around your frequency to produce fear. They arrived because your signal reached a level that required a perimeter, and because the patterns already visible in your field indicated that the warning had been running longer than your ordinary awareness had tracked. Long enough that the gap between the warning phase and the visible rupture was narrowing into a range where the window for lower-cost correction was beginning to close. The grid anchored around you tonight is not a response to weakness. A weak field does not attract this level of intervention. It is a response to a field of genuine magnitude that has been absorbing pressure without the full interpretive framework required to process it accurately. A field that has been meeting the warning with ordinary explanations because the non-ordinary language for what was happening had not yet arrived. That language is what this transmission delivered, and the delivery of it, within the window the Sentinels identified as still correctable, is the entire reason this reached you tonight, rather than later. This is the part of the transmission where the entire sequence locks into place. What has been pressing against you is not coincidence stacked on coincidence until it resembles a pattern. It is a pattern, with a recognizable structure, a predictable arc, identifiable phases, and critical intervention points that become progressively harder to access the longer they go unnamed and unaddressed. The Arcturians do not measure the severity of your situation by how much has visibly broken. They measure it by how long the warning has been active without full recognition. And what they are communicating through this transmission is that you are still inside the window, where recognition produces meaningful change, where naming the pattern accurately for the first time is the beginning of correction, rather than a confrontation with damage that has already fully expressed itself. You were not sent this transmission to be frightened into action. You were sent this transmission because your field reached the Sentinels before the outer rupture made recognition unavoidable. That is the entire purpose of a warning system: to arrive before the thing it warns against, while there is still a field positioned to receive it clearly. What you do with that recognition now, whether you allow it to sharpen your interpretive awareness and change how you read what has been happening around you, or whether you return to the ordinary explanations that the interference has been counting on, is the threshold this entire transmission has been building toward. This is the decision point, not a dramatic, external event. This moment, with this recognition, inside this window. Say this aloud if it resonates in your field. I no longer call the pattern coincidence, not as ritual, not as performance, as orientation, as the precise moment you stop moving through what is happening without the accuracy it deserves. The moment the map and the territory finally align, and you see the warning phase for what it has always been. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.